All right, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That we're going to hear a discussion on the relationship between bioelectric fields, past life lethal injuries, past life first-person memories, neonatal amnesia, and its possible relationship to the loss of past life memories in childhood. That apparently is a launching off point for further exploration of what this all means and how to interpret it and understand it in terms of what it says about reality. So very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Richard Silberstein today. With over 35 years of neuroscience research experience, Richard is the originator of the Steady State Topography brain imaging methodology and has authored and co-authored numerous publications in various areas of cognitive and clinical neuroscience. Please join me in welcoming Richard.
Thank you.
Just actually I'll do a switch.
And we go full screen. Right.
All yours.
All right, thank you. Russ, thank you very much for, first of all, the warm welcome and also the invitation to present here. I must admit, I've had a very long-standing interest in parapsychology and related philosophy, and it's been some disappointment that I've never actually seen a full-fledged parapsychological research sort of effort within Melbourne, because I know there are lots of people interested in the area, but it's never seemed to have gelled, so congratulations on sort of bringing things together. Okay, as for my talk, I tend to move around a bit, so that's the mic, is it?
Would you prefer to hold it in your hand?
Yeah, look, I might, if that's okay.
It's on.
All right. Russ mentioned some of the points I'm going to be discussing. Just about gave the talk, not quite. So let's just have a look. First of all, we all know about Ian Stevenson. I'm sure you've had talks about it. Starting in the very late 60s, early 70s, he did an enormous amount of work in examining the claimed memories of past lives, particularly of children, and more or less tried to validate whether, in fact, their claimed recollections were accurate. And in many cases, they were remarkably accurate. Now, he's since passed away. And as I said, one of his main interests was, and I put in brackets, is, question mark, the interest in the relationship between birthmarks and past life injury. Now, I must admit, when I first read about the focus on birthmarks, I thought, I was a bit underwhelmed, I must admit. I thought, well, you know, why do you focus on that? They're just physical things. Surely the important thing is consciousness, what it is that has actually transferred from one life to the other. And probably the most relevant issue here is what is the accuracy of the memories that these people carry, because that, in a sense, is probably the most important evidence for consciousness continuing in some form. So I thought the focus on birthmarks, you know, was interesting, but I thought hardly important. And then I thought a little bit more about it, and now I think it's probably one of the most important things in terms of what it says. So let's just touch on that briefly. I'm sure many of you have come across sort of books by Ian Stevenson and his successors, Jim Tucker. They've now got on records at the University of Virginia thousands of cases, not just in the East, in areas where reincarnation is accepted as a reality, but in the West as well. And as I said, as we speak, these numbers are increasing. So the evidence is really very, very strong. And so this is one case, a Turkish case, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the names because I'm absolutely hopeless about it, where this child was born with a birthmark, a bleeding birthmark just under the chin. And when he was born, just a minute, let me just, if you don't mind, just one of the joys of age. Right, okay. So when he became able to speak, he described, as I said, a life of another Cemil Hayek, a distant relative who committed suicide in a gun battle with French colonial police. Now, the interesting thing is that police identified the entry and exit wounds of Fauci's at right chin and left of the top skull. And this is, in fact, a reconstruction of the injuries suffered. Now, what was fascinating was that there were, in fact, birthmarks at both the entry point and the exit points. And he also describes, essentially, bit by bits, what actually happened, but also that the memories of the previous lives also influenced nightmares, but these wore off by the age of about 6 or 7. And I want to come back to that. The issue of neonatal amnesia. Why do the memories actually fade? Now, there have been many cases like that. Generally, they are characterised by people who have died relatively young and generally violently. And the birthmarks have been associated with the location of the lethal injury in the previous life. So it's hanging, stabbing, etc., etc. But generally, they've occurred a relatively short period of time, and they've been associated with real injuries. Now, what was fascinating is a case described by Jim Tucker of what they call experimental birthmarks. And this is where, let me describe it to you. Girl born in Thailand, and her maternal grandfather had died 5 years earlier at the age of 59. One of his daughters decided to mark his body and made a mental wish that her father would take them back with him whenever he was reborn. Now, 2 hours after he died, so it was well and truly after he had died, she in fact put a soot mark on his leg just above the ankle. Now, and this is also not uncommon, the mother of the girl reported a dream that her father was coming back, wanted to live with them, and the child was born 5 years after her grandfather had died with a particular birthmark at the point where the soot mark had been made. Now, in this particular case, this was not the cause of death. This was simply a marking made and a wish, and it was somehow conveyed. So clearly what's happening is, now, it's not conveyed by physical processes, certainly not by any physics that we understand at present. Maybe in a few 100 or 1,000 years we will understand it. But right now, it's not physical. There is something non-physical that had transferred it. So somehow or other, we went from something physical, then consciousness, and I've just got that symbolically, because I think there is an enormous amount of increasing evidence that the traditional neuroscience hypothesis about the nature of consciousness, put bluntly, is wrong. The traditional one, and the overwhelming majority of neuroscientists tend to publicly say this is their position, although interestingly after a few drinks they might say something else. But generally what they say is, well look, the brain, physical body, matter, energy, that's all there is. And consciousness is simply what the brain does. It's just a function of the brain, and a fascinating, slightly mysterious function of the brain, but it's physical at the end of the day. It's what the brain does. Now, what I'm saying is that physicalist, or if you will, materialist hypothesis is proved pretty fundamentally wrong by Stevenson's research and Jim Tucker's research on memories of past lives. Clearly, nothing physical has managed to transfer, so the information must be stored in some fashion at a level of consciousness where the information is preserved, and somehow or other, through some mysterious processes, we don't know what they are, we come to a point where there is another physical manifestation, a birthmark, and as I mentioned, others. So what I want to discuss is this process here. Now, some of these processes involve consciousness, And I don't think that any scientific methods we currently have can really track that, can really observe that. But at some point, we come to a physical process, because these birthmarks are physical. So there must be something physical influencing the development of the fetus, for example, which causes the birthmark. There must be one stage in there, or a series of stages which are physical. So you go from the non-physical to the physical. So there's that interaction. And what I want to discuss is what might be one of those processes, because I think there's a number of them. I don't know how many there are, but what's at least one of them? And whatever that process is, it must be able to influence the development of cells in the fetus, for example, and maybe other things as well, such as the way the brain evolves, the way the brain develops, I should say, and the way memories are stored in the brain so that you've got access to them. And that's what I want to discuss. So, how do we go from something which is non-physical? These are process one, I'm arguing, is non-physical. I don't know what it is. And whatever, this might be the first or one of the physical processes affecting birthmarks. Now, I'm going to apologise at this stage. There's a little bit of science here because I believe that birthmarks, that bioelectric fields play an important part. That's not the whole story, but it's a part of the story. So, but let's just talk a little bit about some philosophy here. I've mentioned there's a thing called consciousness, which is non-physical. And then there are these physical things. The brain is physical. The birthmarks are physical. Matter, energy, etc. You look as if you've got two completely different things. You've got the world of physics and you've got consciousness. Are these completely different things? Essentially dualism. Now, I think at one level, yes, you are talking dualism. They are different. But are they fundamentally different at a very, very deep level? And what I'm suggesting is there is maybe something that is even more fundamental than matter energy and even more fundamental than what we currently recognise as consciousness. This sort of very, very deep, fundamental underlying reality, or non-reality, so to speak, is something which essentially both of these things emerge from. Consciousness emerges from that. The world of matter, energy, the galaxies all emerge from that. That more fundamental thing is a sort of a much deeper level of consciousness, I would argue. So, in one sense, if you're a philosopher, you'd regard that as what's called neutral monism. There is one fundamental reality, but it's much, much deeper than even what we call consciousness, the non-physical aspect of consciousness, and the domain of physics, matter, energy, etc. So I just wanted to sort of make that point.
Can I ask
But
a question?
sure.
So given that the aspect of unity, do you think that matter is a deeper manifestation of spirit?
No, I would say matter, energy and consciousness are both manifestations of that deeper reality. In other words, look, the analogy I tend to have in my mind is this. If you've played ever with electrostatics, in other words, get a bit of plastic, rub some wool on it, and you can pick up pieces of paper. Right? That's an electric field. Now, you can get a magnet, and it'll pick up little bits of iron and point north, etc. That's a magnetic field. They look completely different. Yet, they are both manifestations of something more fundamental called the electromagnetic field. In other words, there is this more fundamental reality, which is more fundamental than either of those two. And I think that deeper reality is much more fundamental than matter energy.
It transcends reality.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So, the notion that, how can consciousness and matter energy interact was one of the original criticisms of dualism when Descartes presented it. If they're so fundamentally different, how on earth can they interact? And the point that was made by Spinoza, but many philosophers and scientists since then, is that they can interact because they are both manifestations of a much deeper, more fundamental reality. So that's what I wanted to sort of just mention about that. So In terms of that process end, how do we go from consciousness, non-physical, to a birthmark? There's got to be some process, and what I'm arguing is that bioelectric fields are that. Okay, so here comes the reason I apologised. A little bit of science. How do cells make electric fields? And the person whose work I'll be basing some of this on is Mike Levin, based at Tufts University, who's been doing some of the most exciting work on the role of bioelectric fields in health, in development, etc. Basically, he's rewriting our understanding of developmental biology and biology. So, let me just go on. How do cells make electricity? Well, let's start off with salt, but maybe potassium chloride, the sort of salt you can have if you've got blood pressure problems. It's made up of charged particles, atoms which have lost or gained an electron. So, for example, the potassium atoms lose an electron and give it to the chloride, so they become positive, and the chloride atom becomes negative. And these are called ions. Now, when you put them in solution, they just float around happily in the water, and you've always got an exact number of positives and negatives, so the water's always neutral. Everything is neutral, not a problem. Now, this is meant to represent a cell. Inside, you've got these positive potassium, K, that's potassium, and negative Cl, that's chlorine. Now let's assume the cell has these little pores, and these ions can only go through the pores. And suppose these pores or channels only allow potassium to get through, but not chloride. Now, because if you've got no potassium outside, what will happen is one of these potassium ions will come along, go through here and just continue on because there's more of them here, so it's less likely to sort of pop back. And when that happens, it's called diffusion force, and what happens is you end up with more potassium ions outside and more chloride ions inside, because now there are some potassium ions missing. And so what that means is that the inside becomes negative because there's more chloride, negative charges, and the outside becomes more positive because the potassium ions have leaked out. And you can measure that just with a voltmeter, and you can also measure it with what are called voltage-sensitive dyes. These are dyes that change their colour depending on what the voltage is, and generally the inside is negative, the outside is positive, and the voltages can go anything from generally around minus 70 millivolts, that's thousandths of a volt, up to about minus 20, etc. So that's the way a cell makes electricity, very simple. The way cells talk to each other, nerve cells in particular, use what are called synapses. I won't spend time on that, but the other thing they can do is cells in your body, not just in the nervous system, can basically create these contacts between each other, these short circuits here. And those short circuits, if you've got two cells that have different voltage, will create essentially a battery which will cause an electric field. And these bioelectric fields you can then actually measure using these voltage-sensitive dyes. So, for example, here is, I'm not sure exactly what that is, some sort of small developing fish, and these colours represent the voltages in different parts of the body. So, for example, minus 20 millivolts around here, the front, and around the blue, minus 70 millivolts. Okay, they're pretty pictures, but does it mean anything? Does it make any sense? Does it influence anything at all? Well, what I'm suggesting is yes. Here's an example from Mike's work. There's a little life form called planaria. They're sort of little worms, and they reproduce by splitting. So what happens is they'll split in half. The tail will grow a new head. and where the head was, it'll grow a new tail. So that's the way they reproduce. They just split. And if you cut the planaria, it will more or less do its thing. It will create a new tail, and this one will create a new head. And you can do this actually many times, and I'm not suggesting this is desirable, but you can cut it a number of cases, and each of them, the part that was facing this way becomes a head, and the part facing that way. Now, how do they know what's to be a head and what's to be a tail? And what Mike's Levin group has looked at is, are bioelectric fields telling this system, this has got to be your head and this has got to be your tail? So what he did was, okay, you get a planaria, you make a cut here and a cut here, and then briefly you apply a drug which just basically blocks the electric field, just briefly, for about an hour or two. And then you let the planaria develop. And what you in fact find is now it's developed two heads, because it was the original electric field that said, hey, this is a head, this is a tail. Now that instruction is gone, oh well, let's just build two heads. Now you might say, well, that's just due to the effect of the drug. But what you can do is, when you cut these, they also develop two heads when there's no drugs. And in fact, that goes on indefinitely. And in the future, if a biologist happened to come across one of these in a pond, he would say, oh my God, it's a new species, there's new DNA, it must be, let's look at the DNA and see what's there. And what they would find is, the DNA is exactly the same. There's no differences. It's the electric field which gives the instruction on what to do. And that's actually just a movie that it's real. These two-headed planaria. Okay, so what does this suggest? Well, what we do know is, okay, how is the body built? Because ultimately I want to get to the point of the birthmarks. How? Because birthmarks are developmental changes. How do we get there? Well, just a little bit. First of all, we know about the genetic code, DNA. That was discovered in early 60s, late 50s, etc. We all know about that. Then people realise, oh no, wait a minute, just because all the genes are there, every cell in your body has the same set of genes. So, how does some set of cells know, oh, I'm an eye, or other set of cells say I'm a piece of skin, other cells. So there's got to be instructions on which genes become active, which ones are not active. This is not your time, be quiet. And this is what's called the epigenetic code. Okay, that was discovered about 30 years ago or so. No big deal. What Mike Levin's work shows is, actually, this is really only a part of the story. From his point of view, and I agree with him, genes are a toolkit. They're not actually the instruction set on what to build. The instruction set are the bioelectric fields. They're the ones that determine and tell certain parts of the body, you're going to be an eye. And I don't have time, and I suspect you may not be that interested in going through the biology, but the fact of the matter is, the bioelectric fields are the instructions that tell different parts, different cells, what to do. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is the bioelectric fields constitute a plausible mechanism for process N, that physical process, whereby consciousness influences the developing human fetus producing the birthmarks. In other words, consciousness, having experienced a violent death, for example, that image is still there, and in a sense, as the process of fetal development takes place and there is an interaction between the incoming consciousness and fetal development, inadvertently or intentionally, I don't know, there is a change which influences the development of the fetus. And in fact, I'm quite sure that consciousness influences the development of the fetus so that certain genes are expressed, others are not expressed, etc. So what I'm also suggesting is that bioelectric fields are also constitute a plausible mechanism whereby consciousness influences the developing human fetal brain and producing the conditions necessary for the recollection of first-person past life memories. So why did I get so excited about birthmarks when I first thought, this is a bit boring, you know? The reason being, if in fact there is evidence that consciousness can influence the developing body for something as crude, if you will, as a birthmark, well, it stands to reason that it can also influence the developing brain as well, so as to actually lay down memories which can then be retrieved on a first-person basis. The whole issue of the nature of memory is a huge and complicated one, because I think memory exists on multiple levels of reality. There are the memories encoded in the brain, and there are memories encoded in some other fashion, which can sometimes be tapped into. People have talked about Akashic records, etc. But also there are, if you will, first-person memories which relate to other past lives, which exist in some particular form. But generally, if I were to ask you now, what did you have for breakfast? That memory is encoded in physical structures in the brain. So if you've got access to first-person memories, it's because they're currently encoded that you can tap on them. And what I'm suggesting is bioelectric fields may play an important role in that. So let's just have a brief look. So if the past life memories can be recalled, where are they likely to be? Well, there are a number of neural structures within the brain which encode and store memories, many of them. One of the important ones, but by no means the only one, is a region deep in the brain called the hippocampus. You have one on either side of the brain. It's in the temporal lobe, roughly about here, etc. And any new experience is first stored there and then stored elsewhere as well. So changes in brain hippocampal synaptic connections during the development, etc., may be the mechanism by which bioelectric fields influence those structures, leading to the child having first-person memories after birth. Now, this may well happen, you know, possibly very early, but certainly during the third trimester, when the brain is developing rapidly, but possibly even earlier. So let's just have a brief look at memory, because it's got a number of things. First of all, there are what's called declarative memory. These are the memories that you've actually generally got conscious access to. And then there are the so-called unconscious or non-declarative memories. So for declarative, there's the sort of episodic memory, facts, you know, what is the capital of France, you know, etc. And also personal specific memories, like what you did have for breakfast this morning, those of you that had breakfast. And, you know, as I said, episodic memories and semantic memories. And then there are the non-conscious memories, so-called procedural memories, how to ride a bike, for example. Many of these sorts of memories, they're not actually consciously held, but you get on a bike, and if you know how to ride a bike, you automatically do it. You just know it, etc. And also, there are what are called priming memories. You know, if you have a particular experience, that can influence your response to a subsequent experience, even if you don't consciously recall it. Now, to use the old hackneyed iceberg analogy, most of your memories are in fact unconscious. The declarative or the conscious memories are the very tip, so to speak. So the interesting thing is past life memories seem to fade by about the age of 4 or 5. Now this is in most cases. There are notable exceptions, and we have one in the audience clearly. Well, although it happens when you're unconscious, so maybe it's a different sort. Okay, so the early period when past life memories can be retrieved corresponds to a period prior to what's called neonatal amnesia. Let me just take you through what that is. By the time children are about 2, they do have access to memories of what happened previously. I mean, it's a bit difficult because they're still coming to terms with language, etc. But the interesting thing is from about the age of 5 onwards, they seem to lose those memories, lose access to those memories. And what seems to happen physically is that time when those memories seem to be wiped, and what I'm talking about are conscious access to those memories, is when this hippocampal region is growing rapidly. It's almost as if the past life memories or these earlier memories are being sort of squeezed out, so to speak, but in terms of new memories coming in. It may not be just that, so they essentially become unconscious. So, as I said, research indicates that while long-term memories are susceptible to neonatal amnesia, they're unconscious, they still are there and can have an effect. Now, does the process of neonatal amnesia sort of bring the curtain down on past life memories so that, in a sense, we can engage better with whatever the lessons of this current life are? So, when we're looking at it, what I'm suggesting, in fact, is that past life memories are actually with us all the time. But most of them are unconscious. They are the implicit ones. And that these memories are primarily unconscious and, apart from special cases, only conscious prior to the manifestation of neonatal amnesia. Now, I just want to touch on a topic that's slightly controversial, but I just want to touch on it because I think it may have some relevance. As you know, there is a growing issue and concern about gender dysphoria, people feeling that they're born with the wrong sex. Now, there may be many reasons for this, but Jim Tucker has suggested in an interesting paper that in his research, children whose previous past life was that of a different sex did seem to have more difficulty adjusting to the current sex of their body. He described one case of a girl who, until 8 or 9 or thereabouts, insisted on urinating standing, and she recalled the life of a male in a previous life. So what I'm wondering is, to what extent does a past life of a different sex influence the possibility of manifestation of gender dysphoria that we see at present? So, as I said, a slightly controversial topic, but I think it's a real one. So what I've tried to do in this discussion is, first of all, take as given the research of people like Stevenson and Tucker, and an enormous amount of work on the reality of reincarnation. I think there's really very, very strong evidence for that. And what I've tried to do is look more closely in terms of our current understanding of neuroscience, our current understanding of biology, of what might be the processes involved which enable memories to actually continue. And one of the factors appears to be a short interval between past life and the current life, and also one where the person, when they died young. And generally, in unfortunate and violent circumstances, that seems to sort of carry over. And there are many cases like that. I think there's a fascinating convergence taking place within the sciences, and I said the role of bioelectric fields, I think, play an important role in that as well. Bioelectric fields do not constitute proof of reincarnation, but they're just a step, an important step in the process. And I think an understanding of reincarnation, apart from, I think, giving one a realistic view of an aspect of the nature of reality, I think also has important implications possibly in medicine and healing as well, as this might be an example of. So with that, so just a brief summary as an academic I'm forced to do, as you know, recent scientific discoveries, etc., the role bioelectric fields, and that these bioelectric fields constitute an information storage or memory system guiding the development of the body, and that in addition these could also play a part in the memories of past lives that children demonstrate under certain circumstances, and also why they disappear as well. And maybe it's just as well they do disappear, otherwise you'd be continually sort of obsessing about a past life and maybe a particular grudge you had against somebody as well back there. I'm being a little facetious here. Okay, so with that, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to questions. Yep.
So I'm burning to ask you this question. How do you believe consciousness can affect the bioelectric fields?
Okay. There's an interesting one. That's a very important, interesting question. Okay, what creates the bioelectric fields? It's the difference between, the inside concentrations and the outside concentrations, and whether the little pores allow potassium to get through or not, etc. So those pores, they're called conductance pores, and there are molecules there that determine whether they're in one shape, they can let the potassium through. If they're in another shape, they don't. Whether those shapes, what those shapes are also determined by quantum processes, quantum physical processes. And those are statistical. In other words, they're probabilistic. And it could well be that consciousness, and a number of authors have suggested this, can influence the statistics of these channels in a subtle way. Now, does consciousness need to know, look, I want that cell to become a little bit more positive, I want this cell. No, it doesn't work that way. In a strange sort of way, it's a little similar to what Mike Levin at Tufts University has discovered. At present, a lot of the work in biology and trying to use DNA and genetic information for treatment of diseases works from the bottom up. You sort of see a disease and say, now, what gene do I need to manipulate so that I get to what I want to do with that particular one? And in most cases, that approach has been hopeless, because almost every condition has hundreds of genes involved. What Mike's found is that the bioelectric field, for example, it's like a master instruction. It says, make an eye here. And what then happens is, in some strange way, literally everything else falls into place. There are subsequent processes. And what I'm suggesting is consciousness probably operates at that higher order level. Basically, this is the character, this is the personality that this entity is going to imbue. So this child, when born, it will have this particular character. So it's a top-down process. How does it occur? I really don't know. But I'm sure that it's not bottom-up. I'm sure that consciousness is not spending all its time thinking, oh, this cell needs to be that cell needs to be... That's impossible. It's the other way. And that's the way biology works. It works from the top down. And so I suspect that's how it's happening. But at core, it's quantum processes which are statistical, which I think consciousness is influencing. Now that's an ominous sign. No questions. Okay, I think I saw your hand there first.
Going back to one of the first examples about the soot mark on the leg, how does the biofield theory explain that?
Well, I think much the same way as it describes things like character. In other words, the most straightforward interpretation I would have of that is that the consciousness of the father was still there, around, not in the body, but so to speak, in the environment. And we know that this sort of thing is consistent with all of the research on near-death experiences and NDE. That for quite a while you're sort of around, above the body, looking around, etc., etc. And so, particularly if, one of his children is thinking, I want you to have this, and he picks that up and decides, yeah, why not? And I think that just simply holding that thought, so to speak, at the non-conscious level is enough to influence the development of the fetus. once again, it's no more mysterious or explainable than any other birthmark. For example, when you're stabbed and you die, well, okay, consciousness, it wasn't consciousness that was stabbed. Consciousness still continues. So why is there a birthmark at the point of where you were stabbed? It was held in some fashion by consciousness, the entity there, prior to birth, yeah. Now, I think I saw, yep.
Trying to formulate my question as I was sitting there, but so I'm trying to understand when you spoke about neutral monism and this idea that consciousness and physical matter are perhaps manifestations of some sort of third or deeper,
much deeper reality, yeah. So
yeah.
Which is more like what we would call consciousness.
And that was one of my
That exactly. It would. I'd call it deep consciousness,
yeah, okay.
as opposed to our consciousness.
That does actually answer one of my questions, which is helpful. But so, and the bioelectric fields, in your view, would they act as a sort of like a modulating process?
I think only
or are they a manifestation?
More of a modulating process at the physical level.
Yeah.
In other words, if the nature of the relationship between consciousness and the brain, I think, is a subtle one. It's not as simple as, look, it's just like me driving a car. I'm not the car, I'm consciousness and the car is my body, etc., where you're different to that. I think what can happen over time is consciousness and, if you will, brain processes start to mutually identify. So you feel as if you're just one person, just one, but you're actually, that one dissociates under extreme circumstances like near-death experience, deep meditation, some various form, some of the drug experiences are related to that as well. But under usual, normal waking consciousness, we feel as if we're just one, but in fact that one is because the two clearly identify very, very closely. So they're mutually interacting all the time, and so these bioelectric fields, I would argue, are part of the means by which consciousness and the brain are constantly talking to each other. Is there a part of the brain where consciousness seems to be central? It was one of the Australian Nobel Prize winners, Sir John Eccles, argued that it must be, around the left hemisphere where speech is. No. It doesn't appear to be some region of the cortex, because you can have situations where people have been born with hardly any cortex due to hydrocephalus, and yet they can be very conscious. In fact, they can be sometimes quite capable. Also, we know that if they've been damaged to the cortex, the person can still express emotions and still seems to be conscious, may not be able to communicate. And there's growing evidence that a region deep within the brainstem known as the periaqueductal grey, it's common throughout, it's about all animals, that seems to be the region which is associated with consciousness. If networks associated with that region are damaged, there's a loss of consciousness. Interestingly enough, that region is also associated with networks that give rise to deep mystical experiences as well. I'm not saying consciousness lives there, but I'm saying if there are regions in the brain which seem to be sort of the main interacting regions, that's probably the most important one. It's fundamental. Animals are conscious. They all have periaqueductal grey, sort of fish, etc. So it sort of makes sense something as ancient as that. Yeah.
Sort of purpose-built to maybe channel consciousness. Word, but yeah.
I mean, the whole issue of how life evolved on Earth is a fascinating one. Paul Davies, the scientist, wrote and described the evolution of how did life evolve? How did inorganic matter give rise to organic matter? And you need to have so many steps okay, need to have so many steps occur for life to occur that he described it as climbing Mount Improbable. It's just, come on, give me a break. The probability of that happening. But if consciousness can influence quantum processes, and there's a lot of evidence for that, particularly from Dean Radin's work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where it's shown that just concentrating on, for example, a quantum experiment, a double-slit experiment, you can change the behaviour of photons by just meditating on them. If consciousness can influence quantum processes, there's no reason why it can't influence chemical processes, and basically tilt the odds in favour of the evolution of life. So consciousness probably was pre-existent to even life. In fact, I think, as I said, it's fundamental through the universe.
And that's what, sorry, I'm realising I'm taking all the question time, but when you say consciousness as a fundamental, that's sort of more of a phenomenal consciousness rather than this. It's I suspect our individualised or our personal sense of consciousness is real, but it may be actually the manifestation would have arisen from something much more fundamental than that. What that is, I don't know. Thank you.
Right. I think I saw the lady hand go up first, you, and then your hand. Okay. Yep.
So what I heard was to tap into this kind of memories. One way is neonatal amnesia. So is it done through hypnosis?
Oh, okay. In fact, the next speaker I think is going to be very, very relevant here. No, what I'm saying, some people have used hypnosis. There are other imagery methods on recollecting past lives, etc. Sometimes they occur spontaneously. You're in certain places and suddenly you feel strong emotions. That's quite often an indication, something's there. But certainly hypnotic regression methods, one author, Helen Wambach, used almost group hypnotic methods, and some people have been a bit critical of that, but that's it. In many cases, people are using past life regression methodology and sort of saying, look, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not, if in fact it addresses a phobia you have or something effectively, and it seems to, then let's just go with that. I think the evidence is that it's real. But there we are. Sorry now. Yep. Right. Sorry.
Yeah, two-part question. So one of my favourite authors who wrote the book Angel Tech, A Modern Shaman's Guide to Reality Selection.
Okay.
His name is Antero Ali. So he posed an idea that DNA is actually a conscious design program, and that it's under instructions from the mysteries perpetually churning from the nucleus of the atom. Okay. So it's like, if you look at things in holographic reality sort of sense, so if each atom basically stores entire universal information, then it's like it's the atoms on a very basic atomic level that influence DNA and give it the instructions to do things. And that kind of ties in with Tim Leary's idea that life basically originated on Earth through meteorites and what do you call it? Amino acids that we found on emergence in meteorites. Yeah. So basically, consciousness arrives in forms of amino acids, and then DNA unpacks itself and starts to evolve more and more complex organisms, eventually leading to us with more complex brains able to evolve. So basically, the idea of DNA is to live forever or die trying.
Okay. That sort of implies that consciousness is a physical structure like DNA, or is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that DNA is a manifestation of non-physical.
Oh, okay, right.
It works from the top down.
Okay, interesting. Although Mike Levin would say the top-down process is bioelectric. In other words, he would argue, and I said, I'm not a developmental biologist, but it sort of makes sense to me that he describes DNA not so much as the instructions on how to make a body, But the toolkit, what you're going to need,
Yeah.
and the instructions are somewhere else.
Yeah. So maybe the way we look at things is dualistic because of our dualistic brain, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
a more intertwined idea. There's
Yeah.
a deeper underlying unity behind things. Like
Right.
you said.
Yep.
Yeah.
But yep.
Is there any correlation between past life injuries and more serious birth defects, like congenital heart disease and things like that?
I don't know about heart disease, but certainly if you have a look at Stevenson's work, there are cases of very severe birth defects, not just moles and locations, but in some cases limbs almost missing or atrophied, at birth. So they can be quite severe. So if you can see manifestations of that so clearly, I can't see why it couldn't affect internal organs that you don't happen to see at first glance, such as the heart, lungs. And in fact, it could well be that many sort of diseases that essentially are considered genetic at this stage, in fact, emerge as a result of past life influences. How you prove that, I don't know, and whether it's in fact even useful to prove that. Surely the most important thing is how do you address whatever the deficiency is. Yeah. By the way, I'm mindful of time, Russ, so you tell me when.
We can take one or two more.
Okay.
I've got one.
Okay.
Just want to make sure I get it in. So you touched on something, not directly, so you touched on extreme hydrocephalus, which is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, or extreme water on the brain, where you have cases where a brain can be, the physical structures of the brain can be atrophied down to 3 to 5% of that of the normal human brain, yet that person continues to function with the full capacity of consciousness. And the standard physicalist explanation for that is that, that just goes to show the extreme neuroplasticity of the brain, right? Well, I question whether that explanation really holds water, so to speak. I just have to throw that in. And so as a neuroscientist, do you feel that that level of neuroplasticity, or that claim of neuroplasticity at that level, is really warranted?
I think if you're sort of saying, look, this proves that, the brain doesn't come up with consciousness or thought, I would agree with you that it's a really hard argument to make for neuroscientists to sort of say when your cortex is almost completely gone, it's sort of just, instead of being thick like this, it's really down to there. On the other hand, one really cannot underestimate just the enormous neuroplasticity that we have within the brain as well. One of the things that's sort of surprising and sort of goes to some of my prejudices is that the early work of the neurologist Lauber, who discovered these cases of children and adults who had essentially huge, what are called ventricles. These are normally the regions where there's fluid in the brain normally, and the cortex is that structure between the ventricle and the skull. And normally it's, say, about that thick. And these are cases where it was down to just, a few millimetres. What was bizarre was some of these people seemed to be functioning very well. They had some visuospatial limitations, but their verbal skills were actually adequate and sometimes superior. And quite a few of them became lawyers. So much for my apologies to any lawyers here. But so, as I said, I think one shouldn't downplay the neuroplasticity that the brain does have. At the same time, it does throw up a pretty fundamental question of how can those residual areas come up with all the things that we said only cortex can do, like speech, etc. I agree. I don't have an answer. I think I saw just one hand go up, or we're just stretching. Okay. Okay, righto.
Just the last one.
Okay, looks like that's it.
Okay.
Well, look, yep. Well, look, no more.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your attention.